All right, I am going to dive straight in. So welcome everyone. I'm so glad that you were able to join us for today's Fix the Gap panel. And yeah, before I start, I do want to introduce 500 Women Scientists. So 500 Women Scientists is an international grassroots organization which is dedicated to making science and society open, inclusive, and accessible. Our programs and efforts are they sort of fall into three arms. One is to build collective power, the second is to change the face of science, and the third is really to hold institutions accountable. I won't be diving into all of these different initiatives today, but some of the things that we've done are host Wikipedia editathons to create pages about underrepresented scientists and really tackle the gender bias, lead different policy efforts around different issues facing women in science STEM. And today we're going to be focusing on Fix the Gap, which is this really awesome initiative that started over a year ago. So I want to tell you a little story about Fix the Gap. It actually started back in January 2021 when our co-founder, Dr. Jane Zelikova, she tweeted out, is there a public database listing a range for speaking fees or honoraria? And the idea here really was to make it easy to set a standard and ensure that scientists, especially women, are getting paid for their time and efforts. It was a random tweet. It went out. And what we found was that there actually was no such database that existed. But we learned that there was a lot of interest from people on, how do you navigate speaking honoraria? Is this something that's common? What do you ask for? How do you decide how to value yourself? And I actually saw this tweet back in January because one of my friends tagged me in, and I was like, yes, I kind of want to know more about this because I'm not sure how to navigate this space either. And I really wish a database existed. And so a few months afterwards, there were a lot of folks who were interested, people like me, Dr. Virginia Shute, Dr. Graham Lowe, and we all ended up sitting together to put together this survey to crowdsource STEM speaking engagement fees and honoraria. We asked questions about, what are the demographics? Do people have a master's or PhD? How many years of experience do they have? What sort of talks have they given? And we really try to crowdsource different honoraria for talks, panels, workshops, keynotes, and more. It did end up going pretty well. We received over 700 responses from STEM professionals across the world, and we compiled over 1,000 honoraria. We ended up building a database, which is live today. It's called Fix the Gap, and you'll be able to see a link in the Zoom chat. And really, we wanted to build this database so that anyone, anywhere can really look up the different honorarias that people have received in the past when it comes to talks, panels, keynotes, guest lectures, and more. You can filter by the type of speaking engagement, you can filter by the person, and all this information is freely available for anyone to access. But importantly, in the survey, we also noticed several themes. We heard from respondents about how they had actually never thought about receiving honoraria before. They expressed that it was difficult to navigate financial compensation, and they also referred to at several points that, a cultural change is really necessary to better value researchers' times and efforts, especially for researchers belonging to historically excluded communities. And so after hearing that, we decided that one way to really normalize financial compensation is to speak about it openly. And that's one of the reasons why we've put together this panel today. We're going to be hearing from three incredible speakers, and I'm going to give a brief introduction before we dive straight in. I do want to flag that if you have any questions at any point, please do drop them in the chat. I'm going to work them into the conversation. We're really trying to answer the questions, thoughts, and concerns that you have on your mind. So without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. She is an incredible climate scientist. She's a professor at Texas Tech University, and she's the author of the book Saving Us, which is really a must read. I'm getting through it right now on how to tackle difficult conversations and really think about the importance of science communication. I'm really excited to have Dr. Katharine here on this panel today because it was actually one of her earlier tweets this year that made me realize, okay, this panel I think really needs to happen, and we really need Katharine as a speaker on this. So welcome, Katharine. Our second speaker is Dr. Kaela Singleton. She is a neuroscientist based at the Emory University School of Medicine. She's co-founded Black in Neuro, which, if you don't know already, is a really incredible organization, which is really uplifting all the different Black neuroscientists who are here across the world. They're incredible to see, and Kaela is incredible. Really excited to hear her thoughts on why it's important to receive financial compensation when it comes to your time, labor, and expertise. We also have Claire Wasserman, who's the founder of the Ladies Get Paid platform and also the author of the Ladies Get Paid book. I read her book earlier this year or late last year, and it's a really interesting book on how to explore financial literacy and how to negotiate, and it includes a lot of different stories from different women across the world. So definitely check out Ladies Get Paid. Definitely read Ladies Get Paid, the book. And I'm also excited to hear Claire's perspective. Claire may not be from the world of science, but she's been helping a lot of women navigate financial literacy. So I'm very excited for her insights. And last but not least, I knew I would forget to introduce myself. My name's Farah. I'll be your moderator for this panel, and I'm very excited to dive straight into this conversation. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and I believe that we'll be able to see our speakers pinned to the Zoom screen in a few minutes. And I'm going to start with our first question, which is going to go to Katharine. So Katharine, why do you think it's important to normalize financial compensation for labor and expertise, including speaking engagements?
Well, first of all, it's something that often we never talk about and we're socialized not to talk about it. But if you're an expert, you deserve to be paid. And for a lot of us, we do this because it's our passion. We do this because we're absolutely convinced that people need to know the information that we have, all of us across any scientific field. But often others are being compensated for their work. And if it doesn't occur to us, if we don't think to ask for it, if we don't expect it, we won't be. And that's a systematic way of undervaluing voices that have already been traditionally marginalized in the space.
Awesome. I'm going to direct this question to Claire next. Why do you think it's important to normalize financial compensation for labor and expertise?
First of all, I should unmute myself. I was going to say first, thank you so much for having me. So I'll just give you a little background on why I started Ladies Get Paid, because that answers your question. I started it first because I had a sexist experience. Okay. And oftentimes that's what triggers all this. It's a personal experience that we have. And because of it, I started to do research around women in the workplace, women and money, and just discovered that the gap of how much we are making and how much our money is not growing, it was so much wider than I thought. And it was really, as an individual, this is the question, as an individual, what can you do to combat something that is historic, systemic, structural, and overwhelming? And the thinking that I had, and this was in 2016, was, well, I better go close my own wage gap, right? I better go ask for more money. So again, starting with yourself. And so I think this is why asking for more money, I mean, it is one of the most powerful things you can do, because it's not only going to change your life this year with that paycheck, but think about if you were to invest that money, the compound interest over time, okay? Free money, compound interest over time. So this is, one of the few ways I think that we can take command. It's not what's going to ultimately close the wage gap at all. We need policy change. We can't sit here and wait. So I would say this is the number one best thing you can do to at least have an immediate impact on your life and your family's life and build that generational wealth, is by asking for more.
Absolutely, to asking more. Kaela, the same question to you. Why do you think it's important to normalize financial compensation for labor and expertise?
Yeah, I think Katharine and Claire's points are really good. And they emphasize a lot of the way that I feel about this. Like, you're being asked for your expertise, for your knowledge base. And I think, like, unfortunately, in my mind, we live in this really capitalist society. And to show that you value something in capitalism is to pay for it. It's like the way that designer bags are thousands of dollars versus purses at Walmart that are like $20 or $30. And so showing that you value yourself is incredibly important. And I also think it shows a lot of like confidence that you have in your range and what you bring to the table as well. So for me, it's about knowing that you're an expert, and like Claire mentioned, making those moves to fix like these wealth gaps and these pay gaps, even in things like postdochood, which I'm a postdoc, or like in graduate pay and things like that. So I think it's really important, and it's a conversation that I like yell at my friends about it all of the time, that like you should be being paid for your labor and your work outside of your job.
Can I just jump in really The other reason why conversations around this are so important is because if we're all, let's say, undercharging or saying, no, I'll do things for free. Well, guess what? Not only do I lose out if I do that, but I'm now making it harder for everybody else to charge, right? And I think this is demonstrating to the employers that if they're going to profit from us, we're aware of that. Like an investment in us is an investment in them. Like to the point earlier of like, this is a capitalist society, so we better act like it. But I really do think if it's hard for you to stand up for yourself, please do it on behalf of everybody else, because it's us banding together that will shift the power towards us as opposed to the employer.
Mhm. So one thing that I noticed in the Fix the Gap survey was that people were concerned, what are things that you should get paid for and what are things that you shouldn't? I'm going to start with Kaela on this one. Are there any particular things that you would expect compensation for and any things that you wouldn't?
So this is a conversation that actually came up last night with one of my friends, in terms of like, do I get paid for like speaking at seminars, or conferences or on panels? And so my like rule of thumb that I have for myself is that if I'm being like invited to speak at a seminar or on a panel, then I will ask for a compensation. Like I will ask for honoraria. If it's like a society-based conference where I submit my work, and I'm like selected for a talk, then I don't worry about it then. But if someone is reaching out to me and asking me to like share my science, my story, my expertise, especially for me, because I get asked to speak about like DEI efforts a lot, I always make sure that I am compensated for those. And there are like specific rules of thumb that I have, like if I get asked by like a high school or something like that, I try to make sure that like I don't take that money, or that like if my honoraria can go back to the classroom in some way. But so for me, it's really anything that I am invited to do, that's like outside of my normal, like I'm not charging my department to give my monthly like seminar series update, but at another institution or something like that, definitely.
Mhm. And same question to you, Katharine. Do you have rules of thumbs when it comes to compensation for different types of speaking engagements?
Definitely. So I think that what Kaela said is really important because in academia, there's certain things that you're just expected to do as part of your career. So speaking at a scientific conference, giving a seminar, sometimes you might get a small honorarium for that seminar, but those types of things that you put on your CV to sort of boost your experience, those things you do not expect to be paid for. And often serving on committees as well is something that just kind of goes with the job. But there's a lot that we do, and I think that she had a really good rule of thumb. If you're being invited to do something and it's not something that you would necessarily put on your CV in a place that would boost your CV, then it's appropriate to ask. And here's what I do. I ask, but I also say, if you're not able to, then, I set a limited number of events I do with no honorarium at all, because I know that some groups have absolutely nothing. Or in some cases, they're like, well, all we have is $50 or $100, And I very much make it a point that I'm asking for this, but I'm also recognizing that you have a budget to work within. And almost always people will say, okay, well, let's see if we can get that. And sometimes they'll say, I'm really sorry, all we have is this. And typically if I'm available, I'll say, well, that's great, I'm happy to still do it. Or sometimes obviously you can't, depending on your constraints. But I think giving them that loophole, and that relates to the question Sarah had in the chat there, giving people a loophole, so it's not like hard and fast, but it's like, I understand that we need to work together, and together we value this information and we respect the learning opportunity that it provides.
And then switching gears for a second, so I'm going to go to Claire. So there was a lot of hesitation around accepting compensation for speaking engagements that we noticed in the Fix the Gap survey. So I'm curious, you're not restricted to science. Have you seen this hesitation also in sectors and disciplines beyond science? And what have you noticed in your work?
So interesting. I have questions and answers here. I mean, I want to know why you think that is. I was pretty surprised. Well, I will say this. Listen, as women, we are socialized to be accommodating, right? And to be nice and to not disrupt. And, there's different variations of that, obviously, depending on, what culture you come from. But generalizing, this is how we feel. And then even more so for women in nonprofits. This is why this was interesting. I'm curious if a lot of the folks in that background, if they had the nonprofit background, where they're then in an environment where oftentimes they are made to feel that more for me means less for you. Okay. So if I get a raise, that means there's going to be fewer resources towards whatever the service is that we were providing, or, you know, the nonprofit. So there is a guilt factor oftentimes that we feel, whether it's, you know, implicit or explicit. But I've never heard of somebody not feeling like they should accept for what they provide. And by the way, just to sort of piggyback off of what was said earlier, always ask, because it at least demonstrates that you know your value, and you can start with a high amount and then caveat it. But I know this is a conversation to have, and then you can filter your decision based on what you're going to be getting from this opportunity, which could be exposure, could be, you know, you say yes to a speaking gig because now you're building your portfolio or your reel, and you can leverage it for, you know, future higher paying opportunities. Like, there is a reason to say yes or no to everything. So you do need to sort of consider it holistically in your goals. But, you know, I think, yeah, I mean, there's a guilt factor, I think, in maybe asking for more if you feel like, again, you're taking resources from somebody else. But I don't know, I'm curious to hear from the rest of the panel why that, you know, if that response also surprised them.
I'll dive into it with a follow-up question, but go ahead, Kaela.
Oh, I was going to say, I think to Katharine's point too, one of the things that, like, there are just some organizations and some like student groups specifically that like I just won't accept honoraria from, because I know how like valuable their work is and how much effort and time they put into it. And I'm like so committed to that cause that I'm like, no, I like, it's okay. Like, I don't need it. And so I think a lot of the times people feel this sort of like strong allegiance, but very much to Claire's point of like, oh, well, if I take this money, then I'm like limiting the budget, or like they're not going to be able to do as much. And so I feel like it's one of the bigger struggles for me, if there is, especially like if there's a Black, queer, trans organization trying to like interact with more people and like have more voices and stories heard. I always try to do those things for free. But it's just because like in my heart of hearts, I'm like, I know how difficult it is to raise money, and that money can go towards something else. So I think it goes back to that, like, you make your rules, you have your like your sort of playing deck, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So I can see a question in the chat from Shira, which I'm going to touch on next. So this is going to be a little bit of a loaded question. I'll start with Katharine here. So in the Fix the Gap survey, we heard concerns from people saying that demanding honorary or speaking fees can paint scientists as greedy or unethical, that it's our duty as scientists to say yes to all of these additional asks to help make science more accessible, and that asking for honoraria will only make science more unequal. These are pretty loaded statements, but I'm curious, Katharine, what do you think?
I'm going to start with the word demanding. I ask, and I think, Kaela, you would say that too. I ask, I don't demand. And I always say, if you can't afford it, let me know what you can. So we're just making clear that, and again, not all circumstances, some things as scientists we are expected to do. And we do them for the benefit of our career, we do them for the benefit of our field, and that is absolutely part of the job description. But increasingly, especially if we are in areas or fields where there's a lot of social relevance to our work, and I'm a climate scientist, so there's a lot of social relevance to the work I do. Increasingly, there's a lot of interest and demand from groups that are outside academia. Or groups that they might be part of academia, but not directly related to what I do. And so if I put them on my CV, that wouldn't be something that necessarily elevates my CV. It's something that I'm doing as community service. So service, as academics, we have research, teaching, and service. But service is only part of what we do. And service includes all of our university service as well as our external service. And so as soon as you start to accept invitations outside the ivory tower, so to speak, that service commitment can just absolutely expand beyond all proportion. And so it got to the point where, for example, for me, to be totally honest, going back a number of years, I was so overloaded with external service, I couldn't even file my travel expenses. I had thousands of dollars in unreimbursed travel expenses because I literally did not have the time of day to take care of those little details. And so what I realized is I needed help. And so I found someone, an amazing person who's still with me to this day, that started off very part-time and then eventually moved into full-time, who she helped me with all of the logistics, and I used my honoraria to pay her. And that was a huge step forward to me because, first of all, I had someone to handle the details. And second of all, she was the one who made the request on behalf of me. I was still and still am uncomfortable asking for money. And I think many of us are. But having somebody, and you could get a student to serve in this position as a part-time, assistant or something, paid by yourself, not by the university. I try to keep those very separate. But having somebody else ask on my behalf was a huge game changer. And she even said, you should be charging for online events. And I was like, really? And she's like, well, of course, they don't have to pay the travel. I'm like, okay. And then she's like, I think you should really be charging a little bit more for online events. And I'm like, really? And she's like, yes, I can tell them if they're not going to, if they can't afford it, that's okay. So I said, fine. So she's actually helped me earn her salary in an enormously helpful way. And you might not feel like you're at that level yet, but man, I hit that level pretty quick as soon as I was starting to talk to the local Rotary Club and, the local school, and just having somebody part-time to be able to help you with that, not only to manage the logistics, but to ask on your behalf. I think it's a great opportunity.
Kaela, I'm going to pass the same question to you. Go for it.
Yeah, I think I do take a lot of issue with like the word demand. And I think to Katharine's point as well, it's not, if you truly think that other people aren't being paid to speak, you're like uninformed or delusional. Like the amount of money, even for like invited seminars that my institutions will pay people, especially during the pandemic, with online virtual events to like come like give talks via Zoom. A lot of the times institutions have the money. If you don't ask for it, they won't give it to you. And so I think that that's like a big part of it as well. Like people are being paid to do this work, and more often than not, they're white men that are being paid to do it. And a lot of the times when they ask women, or specifically like women of color, to come speak about their science and like do these all day Zoom interviews, like Zoomathons, they're really like taking advantage of you, of the fact that like you are not going to ask. And someone also mentioned in the chat that like in other disciplines, people get paid to do these things. And so I feel like academia asks so much of you in terms of that, like, teaching, research, service, and the way that you choose to like align your worth with that is really important. And how you communicate to people, like what you will or will not be paid for, or just asking. I find a lot of the times, if I ask people, like, is there an honoraria associated with this? It really just starts a dialogue and a discussion. Like it's not a confrontation. We're not like pulling up in a parking lot and I'm like, give me $500 or I'm leaving. Like it is a discussion. And a lot of the times they're really open about like, oh, we wanted honoraria for this, but like, we don't have the budget, we can't afford it. And we have conversations about like grants that they can apply for, ways that they can fix that, like approaches they can have. And that's labor on my part, but I like that kind of work because, like Claire said earlier, it helps people who come after me to earn more money. And I think that that is really important. And so I do think that like the idea that not asking for honoraria or accepting it as being like inequitable is coming from this place of naivety about how much money people can actually make like on the lecture circuit, period.
And also just to piggyback off of that, just if for those of us who don't ask, that just means more money for somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
So do we really want to be subsidizing the white men?
Mm-hmm.
There we go.
And we've made a couple of references to different disciplines and sectors. So to you, Claire, how widespread are honoraria beyond academia and science? Do people regularly get paid for their speaking engagements?
Oh yeah. And I think that there's been a real shift since I started in 2016. And I'll take a little bit of credit for it because I've just been, hammering this home. And I'm in a fortunate position where ladies get paid, but you would be very surprised. So many people ask me to do things for free and seemingly shocked when I say, but ladies get paid. And if I don't do it, who will? So I think, and I've been personally shocked by how much money you can make. And I lowball myself. One thing, because it's a lot of money. I mean, you really can't. I mean, people are making, $25,000 from speaking gigs, $30,000. I mean, these are like headliners. One thing that I urge everybody to put into perspective, and this has been helpful for me, is I remember there's been a time where I charged a certain amount and I thought it was a lot, and it was for the time. And I was really scared to ask for it. Okay. Now looking back at that amount, I kind of call it my cute. Now it's so cute because the number is quite small. Now, right, again, everything's commensurate, but I think about today when I charge an amount that feels like a lot, and again, it may be, I project myself into the future, looking back at myself, thinking, oh, how wonderful, that I was nervous about this amount. So sometimes it helps, to get a little perspective in that way and kind of, again, projecting yourself in the future so you can be proud of yourself in the moment. But I mean, this is everybody, especially now, this is a dialogue that we're all having transparently. So people know that they need to pay for labor, and we just sometimes have to remind them.
So I'm going to dive into now the very practical aspects of negotiating and navigating financial compensation. Gotten a few questions in the chat around this. So how do you bring up the question of asking for honoraria? How do you do it in an email or in an in-person conversation? I'll start with you, Claire, since this is literally your domain.
Yeah, I've gone back and forth on this. I mean, I think rule of thumb in negotiating, oftentimes we hear never be the first one to say the number, right? And the thinking behind that is you may lowball yourself, right? If I throw a number out there and it was going to be so much higher, then I definitely shouldn't have said anything first. Okay. Now, if you've done a lot of research, and we can talk about how to do that sort of market research and because it can be difficult to figure out how much to charge. I will say that. But if you feel confident in the market research you've done, why would you not be the first person to say the amount? Because at least when you do that, you're anchoring high, right? And you're taking command of the conversation. Whereas if you say to them, well, what's your budget? And the answer is, well, nothing or a little bit, you may find it more uncomfortable, awkward to then to negotiate them up. Being said, here's what I do. And this is, now I'm outing myself. I always start with a very large number. I say, this is the fee that I charge. However, why don't you tell me your budget? I'm excited about this opportunity. I'm sure we can figure out something together. So what I love about what I'm doing here is I'm anchoring high, I'm asserting my value, I'm letting them know that I've done the market research, but I'm also signaling that this is a conversation and not a confrontation, right? Using the words like, we can figure it out together. Right. Reiterating my enthusiasm for the opportunity. So I'm doing both things, right? Asserting my value, but also, demonstrating my openness. But you have to be, comfortable that you've done your market research and that that's a good amount. And I have definitely, I've been embarrassed where I've said, this is an amount that I want. I think it's a lot. And then I've had conversations with other folks who say, oh, that's actually quite little. Even myself. So, you can also don't have to decide in the moment. In any negotiation you have, whether it's for a full-time job, at your current job or for a speaking gig, this is the beginning of a longer dialogue. So you can get the information from them and say, thank you so much. Let me digest this. Can I set up another call with you or can I get back to you? So then you can take the number they've given you and done your market research. But I don't think there's a really hard and fast rule. And a lot of people want that to be the case. They want one script or one rule. And sometimes you just have to test it out and maybe even do your research first on their organization before you even respond to them. Because you may see if it's, a public company, or you may see they've done quite well, and that'll give you a better sense of how much you can charge here. But right now, the way I'm doing it is I say this large amount, anchor high, and then say, but let's figure it out together.
And just about the comment regarding market research, that's why the Fix the Gap database now exists. You don't have to do the research. You can kind of just head there. I'll direct this question to Kaela next. How do you go about asking for honoraria?
So normally when I get invited to speak, it's normally included in the emails. Like they will be like, this is the honoraria. And I, because I don't have the bandwidth and generally I do have a lot of I'm just a postdoc feelings about this. I don't really negotiate my honoraria unless it's a really big multi-day or multi-speaking sort of engagement. I did one of those last year where I spoke 4 times on campus and they brought me one number and I was like, that is not enough for the 4 different speaking engagements. But normally if it's not in the initial email, I will like follow up, and somebody asked if there's like a script. I have a script that I use, and I can share that with Farah, and maybe she can share. But I normally will follow up and I will just ask, is there an honorary associated with this? And a thing that I found that makes people feel more comfortable doing that, like being very direct in an email, is to include other questions that you also care about. So like, is there anybody else on the panel? Like, what do you want me to speak about? Is there going to be like live captioning or like accessibility questions, things like that, so that it's not just that one question, so that you feel a little bit better. I found that that works really well for a lot of my friends and peers, at least. And then they'll email me back, and sometimes they'll say like, oh yes, like this is what our honoraria is, or they'll be like, no, there's no honoraria for this. But normally it's never, kind of like Claire was saying, it's never just a solid like no. Like I've never just gotten an email back that's like, no, there's no honoraria, and that's the end of the discussion. Normally there's a dialogue to it, and sometimes there's room for like negotiating a small honoraria. Sometimes they're just like, we don't have the budget, and then we have conversations about that. But it's never, I've never felt like it was a confrontation, or like there was any sort of like animosity in it. It really was just them being like, oh, a lot of the times they'll be like, oh, we didn't even think that this was like honoraria-able. And I'm like, that's interesting. But yeah, so that's really how I do it. I really just ask, and then we go from there. And if I feel like I need to negotiate, I will, but a lot of the times I don't. And I should say, for a lot of my speaking engagements, just like conversation or like seminars, the honoraria that I've received ranges anywhere from $200 to $1,000, with like 500 being like the median.
Mhm. Well, thank you for your transparency. Appreciate that, Kaela.
Just
I'm
jump
going
in.
to
Do you mind if I
it.
just
Go
like
for it.
I also would come prepared thinking about all the other things that you could ask for if they can't give you budget. To like a point earlier of, you know, this is about all of your goals, and there's different reasons to say yes and no to things. So for example, I oftentimes, you know, people can't pay me, but I'm promoting my book or the Ladies Get Paid conference on May 24th. So I'll say, can you send out a dedicated email? Okay. And oftentimes that is worth way more than the like $50 that they could give me. And so, by the way, this is called full compensation. So for anybody negotiating at their job, this is the same thing as what I'm talking about doing an honorarium. It's the money you can get plus other things that can bring you value. So have that prepared already, because they may not be thinking about it.
Oh, this reminds me. I had a point earlier to one of the questions. I forgot it, but I just remembered it. To one of the questions about the phrasing was basically like, if you're like making good money now. I'm a postdoc. A lot of us are in academia. None of us are making good money. Like none of us are making good money. We haven't had an inflation adjustment since before I was born. So don't ever let someone gaslight you like that. Like, don't.
Mm-hmm. Katharine, you've already touched on how you've hired an assistant, so I'm going to ask you a different question. So kind of going back to earlier in your career, how do you even find speaking engagement opportunities in the first place? How do you make these opportunities happen?
Well, for me, it happened very organically. I was not looking for this to happen at all. I thought the way that I could have impact was through focusing my science on policy relevant questions that would help inform decision making at the city and state and national level. And I had done a few external speaking engagements, sort of preaching to the choir, to community groups who were very concerned about climate change and wanted an update from a climate scientist so they could be even more worried than they already were. But what happened to me was I moved to West Texas. And I was actually the plus one. The university wanted my husband, and I was the spousal hire they had to put up with to get him. The irony is, after he got tenure, he quit, and they're still stuck with me. So here I was in a place where I am still the only climate scientist within a 200-mile radius. And within a couple of months of arriving at the university, people got curious, and they're like, there's somebody who understands climate science. Let's ask them some questions. And so I started to get invitations. And here's how I feel like this ended up sort of snowballing. When I got an invitation to speak to a local women's group, a book club, the Senior Citizens Home, I would do my very best to start with where they were at, and I would listen really carefully to the questions I got. because the questions that we get are the things that people wanted to know that they didn't hear. And so every time I would review and revise what I was going to share based on the questions that I got, so that I was presenting as much as possible what people actually wanted to know, giving the value. And when you give the value, it snowballs, because then somebody's there and they're like, wow, that was great. Let's invite her to speak here. And then, oh, that was really interesting. Let's invite her to speak here. So that is quite literally how this whole thing started, with a handful of invitations to a local women's book club and a discussion group and a lunch club in the local senior citizens home. But today on social media, we can be much more out there. And so there's so many great people on social media, and I think Wendy's right here, and she's a fantastic example of that, who can share their expertise on social media, and that can also lead to a lot of speaking engagements, because a lot of them are virtual these days as well. So just putting yourself out there and providing value for people is a fantastic way to get your message across, because again, we're all in this because of the passion that we have for what we share. And it's a good way to provide people with the information that they're interested in, and a good way to set up the opportunities so when they come your way, you're ready for them.
Now, building on that, at what point do you start asking for compensation? When do you decide it's time, or do you just start outright? I'll start with Kaela on this one.
I feel like my like tale to like doing speaking engagements is like maybe a little bit similar to Katharine's, but different. A lot of it started with like the big like DEI push that happened in 2020 in academia and social media. And so a lot of those engagements for me came with honoraria. So they would like, people would invite me. And I should say, I was like super shocked. I was like a 3-month-old postdoc. I had no idea what I was doing. And they would ask me to speak on my science, but also about like my experience as a Black woman in academia. And they all came with honoraria, like in the initial email. And so for me, from the very beginning, at least at like this stage in my career, I've always had honoraria. And so I've always asked. I think when I was a graduate student, I didn't know to ask. I like really wish I had had a panel like this, because I feel like I did so much extra work and like outreach and speaking engagements and things like that, that didn't necessarily like bolster my CV. It gave me like real life experience, but it didn't actually help me do all that much. So for me, from the very beginning, I've always asked, and I honestly think that is the way that it should be. Like, you should just ask.
And then Claire, to you. So when people start asking for compensation, like what are the common struggles that you've seen people face, especially women and people who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color? I know you've touched on this in your book too.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we've sort of touched on it in our panel today in terms of how we're socialized to not ask, to feel grateful, to not disrupt. That's not just in our head. There are, the possibility that when you assert yourself, you may be looked as aggressive, and that could be received poorly. But again, if you're using language like we figure out together, I'm excited for the opportunity, I'm asking because I'm concerned about gender pay parity, you can make this almost bigger than you, and hold them, accountable to this like larger mission. It's not just about you asking for more. I love that. That's a little trick that I have. That I recommend for anybody negotiating is, I know that you're an organization that values pay parity, even if you don't know that. So it kind of holds them accountable to that.
Mm-hmm. Kaela, go for it.
For me, I didn't even know that you could ask for honorarium. It wasn't until I started, like Kaela, I started to get offered honorarium that I was like, oh, people will actually give me $200 to do this. And I just want to share a story from when I was first beginning, when I had already sort of done the circuits locally and I was starting to get invitations slightly outside of where I lived. I got an invitation to speak to the Society of Petroleum Geologists in Midland, Texas, which, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it is the heart of the Permian Basin, the oil and gas industry in the United States. It was a 2-hour drive from where I live, and I was invited to come speak to their lunch group, and then 2 days before I was going, I got a call because the person who invited me's conscience was starting to bother them. And he said, well, you know that not everybody here agrees with the science. And I said, well, I figured that was the case, petroleum geologist. So down I went, drove myself down in my little hybrid. Turns out he and one other person in the whole room of 150 people were the only people who agreed with the science. I was actually accused of being in it for the money, which at that time I was a research professor on soft money making $55,000 a year by a senior petroleum geologist who was easily into the six figures and possibly more. And they didn't even give me $20 for gas. I paid for all my own gas. They literally give me a crystal ashtray. That was the honorarium that I received, which I kept because it really symbolizes the whole problem with the situation. So that's just, if I had gone back in time, that's something that I would have done differently. But you can always start doing something differently today. And part of that is ensuring, and I love the way Claire put this, and I love the way Kaela put this too, is say, here's what I'm worth, but I can work with your budget. So that's setting the respect level, which often respect is what we're lacking. It's setting that respect level, but it's also showing that we understand the importance of working with people, together with people, and we're partners in getting this message out together.
And Kaela, I'm going to pass the same question that I asked Claire. What are the common struggles that you've seen when it comes to kind of women and Black, Indigenous, and people of color when it comes to navigating compensation? You mentioned something earlier in our pre-panel.
Yeah, I think there are like many layers to this. And Catherine's story actually reminded me of this. So my graduate institution, I went to Georgetown for my PhD. They always have paid speakers for like invited seminar speakers to come to school. They pay for their travel. They also pay them to give a talk, and they pay for their meals. And like all of that is like included in their like invitation to come speak and like see the campus. And I knew that as a graduate student, but when I started getting invitations to speak in honoraria, in my mind, like me and those people were not the same. I thought that like those, especially at Georgetown, unfortunately, those like white male scientists were like worthy of that fee because they were so great. Like they were so like innovators and pioneers in their field, and they did all of this really cool stuff. They were also like all like way older than me too. And so when I started getting honoraria invitations or invitations to speak with honoraria, it took me a while to realize that I was earning those speaking engagements because of my expertise, because of the fact that I'm good at my job and I do interesting science and I have like a nuanced or interesting take on like my field and advocacy and things like that. And so I feel like a lot of the times, especially with Black women and Indigenous women and trans women in STEM, because it's hard to value yourself. It's hard to see yourself in those sort of roles of power and having this sort of like grandiosity where people are like, you're so great and you're like pioneering and innovating and doing all of these things. You undervalue yourself, which I think is something Claire has really emphasized this whole time. And if you continue to undervalue yourself, not only are you selling yourself short, but you're selling like the dreams of other little girls and like people that look up to you short as well. And so I feel like a lot of the times when asking for compensation, that demographic of people, like myself included, you feel like you're just lucky to be here. And that's not the case. Like you really did earn it. You really do deserve it. And there are far more mediocre people in all disciplines making money, saying the same things over and over again. And so I feel like one of the biggest things for me with like encouraging my peers and my friends to like ask for honoraria and get paid is so that they know that their worth is valuable, that they are inspiring. People want to hear their advice. They want to hear them speak and talk about their story and talk about their research and why they're so passionate about it and why it's so cool. And because there aren't that many of us in these given fields, it can be really hard to see yourself as like this leader and this innovator, but you are. And every time that you sort of backtrack or sell yourself short, you're doing a disservice to yourself and to all of the people that like super care about you. Sorry, that was like a mini rant, but for me, it really is like that deep.
I appreciate that. And I'm going to piggyback off one of the last things that you said about encouraging your peers. So what are some practical tips, strategies, or resources that all three of you would like to share when it comes to navigating speaking engagements and honoraria? I'll start with Claire because I know you have a lot of resources you can share.
And I think you know what resource I'm going to say, which is ladiesgetpaid.com. It is free to join. And we have a network of 55,000 folks who are sharing advice. Because here's the thing. I have a master class that you can find on ladiesgetpaid.com for salary negotiation, and you can get my book. But because each of us, our personal situations are different, I think it's just so important to have the peer-to-peer sharing. So you can take everything that's said, which is universal in a framework, but then filter it through, your own needs. So come and join. And also I'm going to give a shout out to our conference because it's free virtual on May 24th, getmoney-getpaid.com. While I think it's incredibly important that we talk to folks in our industries, because there are different considerations and, compensation is contextual. That being said, I think it's also incredibly important to talk to a diversity of people in different fields and different locations. And it'll give you a sense that you are not alone in any of this. So come and join us at Ladies Get Paid.
And I will say, Ladies Get Paid, the book is a really interesting read. So check it out. No one is sponsoring me to say that. I will pass the question to Katharine. Are there any practical tips, strategies, or resources that you want to share?
I don't have anything so organized as a website and a book on this topic, so I love that Claire has that. But I would say two things. First of all, having that script is super helpful because you don't have to struggle for words every time. And then second of all, think ahead. Decide in advance how much time you have available to do these extracurricular activities, so to speak. Decide how many of them you can do pro bono, because I have a substantial number that I to this day do pro bono, because if they literally can't afford a penny, but it is my passion, I will be there for them, but you limit it. And then I have a certain number that I do that are this big, and then I always do a couple of bigger ones to pay the salary of my assistant. And it's a lot easier when you realize it's money for somebody else than it's money for yourself. So just think ahead and decide where you want to be, where you are now, and how much time you have available, because we have so many different things that we need to do with our time. And this is only part of it. So approach it thoughtfully, approach it from a perspective of our time is the most non-renewable resource we have. And so if that's the case, how do you want to spend your time? How much of it do you want to spend on this? And how much do you need to get from that to make it worthwhile? And what you get is not only financial, as Kaela and Claire have pointed out, there's many other things of value we can get from it as well.
Same question to you, Kaela. Are there any practical tips, resources, or strategies that you'd like to share?
I think Claire touched on this, and it's really for me, like talking to your peers, or like talking to people in your field about about like honoraria and these situations. I always deeply value a group chat where you can discuss and be like, I was invited to do this thing, like with your friends, and just be like, should I be like getting paid more for this? Like, how do we feel about this, like as a group? So I think having like an internal network within your field is really important. I also think having, like Claire mentioned too, having people outside of your field. There was a period of time in early 2020 where I was doing a lot of like consulting for like institutions, and I was charging them the same amount of money that I would charge for a speaking fee. And one of my like female mentors was like, what are you doing? She was like, absolutely not. That is a $1,000 at a minimum situation, like an hour. And that was really overwhelming to me. But having people that you can talk to at different career stages, at different experience levels, also with like different levels of confidence. Like not everybody is like super confident. I'm not super confident all the time, but I have some friends who are like super extroverted and like super will be like, that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Having people like that in your corner, like that diversity and personality and perspective, can help you figure these things out. One of my biggest tips, whether I'm negotiating like salary or honoraria, I channel one of my best friends, Dr. Allison Fitzgerald. Her husband is just a white man named Steve. And Allison is an MD PhD, so she's like my best friend, but also like the rock star in that relationship. And whenever I have negotiation questions, I go to Steve and he's like, just channel your inner me, just be me, channel your inner white man and ask for everything that you want. And if they don't like it, just do it, like, just have a conversation. He was like, but just channel your inner Steve. And so that's what I do whenever I'm asking for these kinds of things. I channel my inner Steve and I go, what would Steve ask? What would Steve do? And he would ask for absolutely anything in the mood as well.
I love that. Like hashtag what would Steve ask? That is something we should all be doing. It is somehow already 12:51 p.m., so there are 9 minutes left. I'm going to close it out with our last question, which really could have taken up more time. But today we've really focused more on individual level actions, kind of talking about how we empower you to ask for honoraria. But this entire conversation is about pay equity. It's a structural problem, and it's not going to be individual actions alone that will solve this issue. And I'm hoping that this conversation today is going to open up a bigger conversation on financial compensation. I'm going to start with Katharine because she's going to hop off soon. But in general, Katharine, do you have any thoughts on what are the sort of institutional or systemic changes that we really need to address pay equity to normalize financial compensation?
And I would say to normalize compensation for expertise as well. We live in a world where expertise is attacked and devalued, more than it's been in any time during our lifetimes. And we're also in careers where it's a lot more amorphous. The academic career is a lot more amorphous than if you work for, say an industry where there's a specific set of things that come with the job. And if anything, it makes it much more difficult. It's one thing to negotiate for your salary for a position, but it's another thing to be constantly doing this all the time. But by normalizing it, what we're doing is, I almost teared up when Kaela was talking about how we're doing it for the little girls. we're doing it for everybody who's coming after us and everybody who sees that. And so what I've seen through the requests I've made, which a lot of my requests have related to doing things virtually as well. I've been pushing for that for a long time before COVID, just to reduce carbon as well as time. We're normalizing the expectations of, you can do things virtually that don't have to be in person. You can get paid for doing a virtual event, not only in person. You can ask for something and receive it. We're normalizing the whole pattern of behavior to, again, recognize that our time is the most non-renewable resource we have. And when it comes to the crises that are confronting our world today, the climate crises, the biodiversity crises, the ongoing COVID crises, time is almost the last thing we have. And so really understanding that it's not about us, it's about the greater good. It's about the benefit of everyone who needs this information and us being able to continue to provide it in a sustainable way. Because doing everything pro bono as much as you can with no plan is a guaranteed recipe for burnout. And if we burn out, we're no good to anybody. So it's a huge part of making sure that we can be as efficient and effective as we can. Taking care of ourselves is taking care of others.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Katharine. I really appreciate your time on this panel. I'm going to go through the rest of the panelists, but feel free to drop off when you need to. Claire, I'm coming to you next. What are the institutional or systemic changes that you want to see changing around financial literacy and compensation?
I just want to note, Katharine, I think you have a money tree in your background. That's a money tree, yes? So funny. So maybe that would be helpful for all of us if you need a sort of visual reminder to ask more. So the policy is to close the wage gap. I'm just going to rattle them off quickly. Of course, longer conversation to be had. So first of all, paid family leave. So when you look at the wage gap, it really doesn't start to happen until women have their first child. Okay, it's called the motherhood penalty. So paid family leave, notice I didn't say maternity leave. Okay, so paid family leave plus on-ramping, because the gap begins to widen as women struggle to get back into the workforce. Part of that also is childcare, universal childcare, because oftentimes women are the default caretakers. And again, motherhood penalty ends up being when the gap is widened. Flexibility, it's different industries. Sometimes you simply cannot work from home, but if possible, that has shown it does help women. And then pay equity, meaning audits, salary transparency, that. And but all of this happen, companies can do it, but they are not really held accountable unless, state legislation holds them accountable. So I would say, Google where you live and what, pay policies are in place. And if you can lend your voice to anything that's on the docket or to organizations that are advocating for this, small steps equals big change. So don't lose faith, but I would say start with advocating for paid family leave. That's probably going to have the biggest impact on closing the wage gap.
Mhm. And then same question to you, Kaela. What are the systemic or systematic or institutional changes that you'd like to see? And I will also add, I know that Black and Neuro pays their speakers, so I'm also curious how that can help lead the way.
Yeah, we pay our speakers. And one of the questions that we didn't get to was like, how do we come up with that number? And a lot of it is from like our expertise in a lot of our mentors' expertise about how much they as professors get paid. And so we scale it based on career stage, where like professors make X amount, then postdocs, graduate students, and even undergraduates we pay to speak on panels and like give talks and things like that too. And so a lot of that work has been like a big group think about the way that we wish it was done. And so there are times where it's like, we want to give everybody like $2,000, but we can't afford it because we'll go broke. So we try to do our best to sort of redistribute that math. I think in terms of like structural things that I want to see in academia to fix like pay overall, it's really like more transparent conversations about pay and how much money people make, and that's everything from like professorhood to postdoc to graduate student. I feel like a lot of the times in academia there's this really big myth that like you can like budget your way out of poverty as opposed to someone just giving you more money, and that's pretty much impossible. I live in Georgia, but I also live like really close to my family, and so my cost of living versus my friends who are postdocs at these like elite institutions like Harvard and MIT and Yale and Boston and in New Haven, my salary is going way further than their salary because of where they live and the cost of living. We haven't seen like increases in NIH budgets to handle these kinds of things in like years. We also haven't seen universities really understanding or comprehending, I don't know, I don't know, how much it costs to live in these cities and how big of a detriment it is as a postdoc to have like 7 other jobs to pay your rent, or even as like an early career scientist. So for me, a lot of it is just discussion about salary, discussion about leave, about benefits, just paying people a living wage. Someone said unions in the chat, and I'm very pro union, but having these discussions and having them on like a trainee level, but also having someone in a position of power like take those concerns a step further to be like, my postdocs are going to make like a living wage. Instead of making $50,000 a year, they're going to make like 60 whatever, like 65, I don't know, I made up the number, but you get it. Like having more lobbying and more discussions about what fair pay is and people's real experiences, and just sort of stop gaslighting everyone into thinking they're living these like lavish lifestyles when in fact we're all just kind of like scraping by.
Of course, I will be on mute for the last minute. To close off, I do want to say that, we started off with this Fix the Gap database with honoraria for speaking engagements, but we're also thinking bigger. What if we had a database of salaries? What if we had a database of awards or scholarships? So those are things that we're talking about. We're going to share a survey with all of you in the chat right now and in a follow-up email, because we want to hear your thoughts on if that is something useful. Are these the sort of transparent databases that you are looking for? And the last 30 seconds, I do want to say thank you all so much for tuning in. You're welcome to join in with 5 Women Scientists as a volunteer to sign up to engage. If you're interested in more speaking opportunities, please do check out the Fix the Gap database. I put in a lot of love when I was coding it, so I hope that you enjoy it. There are probably some little things to fix better. And if you have 2 minutes, You can participate in this 2-minute survey that we're actually using to raise up to 20,000. It's a 2-minute survey, just asking some quick questions, and Prove will donate $5 on your behalf. I will stop here, but thank you all so much. Thank you to all of our wonderful speakers, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, Dr. Kaela Singleton, and the wonderful Claire Wasserman. If you have any questions, you know where to find us on email or Twitter. And with that, it's 1 p.m. Eastern. I hope you all have a lovely day. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Get paid.
Thanks so much. Bye.